Why did the room go quiet the moment the general smiled? The question wasn't written anywhere. It lived in the air, hovering between the rows of polished uniforms and the steel table bolted to the floor. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, flattening everything they touched. No windows, no shadows, no place for anyone to disappear. Staff Sergeant Alara Knox sat alone. Back straight, hands flat, eyes forward. She had learned early that posture mattered most when you had nothing else left to control. When your name was already printed in black ink, and the conclusion felt like it had been reached before you ever entered the room. Lieutenant General Raymond Holt leaned back in his chair, relaxed in a way only men with unquestioned authority could afford. He scanned the room, enjoying the attention, then let his gaze land on her as if she were an afterthought. "So," he said lightly, almost amused, "Staff Sergeant, what's your kill count?" A few officers laughed, not loudly, not comfortably, the kind of laughter that happened when people weren't sure whether they were allowed not to. Alara Knox did not move. She did not blink, she did not shift, she did not answer. The silence stretched, thick and uncooperative. If Holt noticed her stillness, he didn't acknowledge it. He enjoyed the imbalance, rank above, enlisted below, the weight of authority pressing down, expecting a reaction. But Alara had decided something long before this room. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her uniform was clean, correct, unremarkable. No ribbons climbing her chest, no visible proof of anything extraordinary, just standard issue fabric lying flat across squared shoulders. The name tape over her pocket read KNOX. The rank on her collar was plain. Staff Sergeant. Enlisted. Easy to dismiss. On paper, her service record was confusing. Gaps where deployments should have been. Commendations written so vaguely they could have applied to anyone. Reprimands that lacked detail but carried weight. It made senior leaders uneasy, not because it screamed danger, but because it refused to make sense. And institutions didn't trust what they couldn't categorize. Around her sat admirals and colonels whose uniforms caught the light. Men trained to fill rooms without speaking. Judge-advocate officers lined the edges, pens ready, building conclusions from pauses and posture. Alara heard everything. The pen clicking once, then stopping. A chair shifting. Paper sliding. The restrained cough of impatience. These were the sounds of people preparing to watch someone be broken, while telling themselves it was procedure. She gave them nothing. Her breathing stayed steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth, controlled, unremarkable, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the first row of uniforms as if the room itself didn't deserve her full attention. She wasn't trying to impress them. She wasn't trying to defend herself. She wasn't trying to be understood. She was simply present. And that unsettled them more than anger ever could. Holt stood and began to pace, boots striking the floor with deliberate rhythm. He spoke about discipline, about transparency, about accountability. He described her silence as hesitation, her restraint as attitude. "She understands the questions," he said, glancing at the panel. "She just chooses when to answer." "Yes, sir," Alara replied. No inflection, no explanation. The room leaned forward. Holt pressed harder, circling closer, his shadow stretching across the steel table. He talked about loyalty, about chain of command, about the gaps in her record. "Do you consider yourself a Marine first," he asked, "or something else?" "Yes, sir." "Which question were you answering?" "I consider myself a Marine, sir." That was all. No speech, no emotion, no performance. The whispers began. Laughter had humiliated her. Whispers were worse. Whispers convicted. Holt leaned into classification next, suggesting secrecy had become her shield, a convenient way to hide incompetence behind black ink. "At some point," he said, Classified stops being protection and starts being avoidance. Would you agree? No, sir. The room stilled. He circled again, narrating her supposed failures as though she were an object lesson. Silence, he said, was not neutral. Silence was a choice. Yes, sir. The sameness of her answers irritated him. He wanted fear. He wanted pride. He wanted something he could dismantle. Instead, he had discipline. And discipline doesn't perform. Behind the rows of power, Rear Admiral Thomas Vance sat quietly, holding a thin black folder that no one else had. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't nodded. He hadn't written. He was watching something different. When Holt casually referenced a maritime tasking designation, one that shouldn't exist on paper, Vance's posture changed. Just slightly. That designation wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this room. Not on record, not with cameras running. Vance didn't interrupt. He waited. Because truth didn't announce itself. It waited. When the recess was called, laughter returned in the hallway. Confident laughter. The kind that believed the outcome was settled. A junior officer quietly set a paper cup of water near Alara's elbow. She didn't touch it. She hadn't lost herself. There was nothing to collect. When the hearing resumed, Holt sharpened his tone. He reframed her last deployment as proximity without participation. Support, not assault. Observation, not risk. Help us understand, he said. Classified, sir. The irritation was immediate. Holt shifted tactics. These operations involved hostile contact, he said. If you were present, then there are metrics we can discuss. He leaned forward. How many engagements? This was the trap. Refuse and she was hiding. Exaggerate and she was unstable. Minimize and she erased herself. The room leaned in. Alara Knox lifted her head. Slow, controlled. 73, she said. The number hit the room like dropped glass. No one moved. Pens hovered, mouths opened then closed. 73, Holt repeated. Yes, sir. And those resulted in confirmed kills. Yes, sir. The air thinned. Under what authority? Joint Maritime Tasking, sir. And the operation designation. This was the final tightening of the noose. Alara did not hesitate. Phantom Trident. The reaction was instant. A pen clattered. Color drained from faces. Holt froze. The name should not exist here. Rear Admiral Vance stood. Stop recording, he said. The red lights went dark. Clear the room. When the door closed, Vance spoke calmly. What you just heard was not a boast, he said. It was compliance. Phantom Trident did not exist on paper. Its operators were erased by design. Silence was not defiance. It was obedience. You mistook restraint for concealment, Vance said, and discipline for resistance. The charges were dismissed. The hearing sealed. Alara Knox stood when dismissed. She didn't look back. Chairs rose behind her unprompted. She walked out the same way she had entered. Unadorned, unchanged. Days later, in quieter rooms, her presence became expected, trusted, not because she spoke loudly, but because she spoke carefully. She never asked to be understood. She carried the truth anyway. Because sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did her silence start to feel louder than the general's voice? The moment lingered after the joke faded, stretching into something uncomfortable, something no one had planned for. Staff Sergeant Alara Knox remained motionless at the steel table, hands still flat, breathing even, gaze fixed ahead. The room had expected embarrassment, maybe anger, maybe a defensive explanation wrapped in forced professionalism. Instead, they got nothing. And nothing, in a room built on dominance, felt like resistance. Lieutenant General Raymond Holt straightened slightly, the easy humor draining from his posture. He hadn't expected the silence to last. It was supposed to be a nudge, a way to remind everyone who held power here, a reminder that rank could make anything sound harmless. But the silence didn't bend. "So," Holt said again, slower this time, his tone shifting from joking to curious. "No answer." Alara Knox didn't look at him. "Yes, sir," she said instead. The response landed wrong. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't submissive either. It was precise, controlled, like she was responding to a question no one else could hear. Holt narrowed his eyes just slightly. He began to pace, boots tapping against the polished floor, a deliberate rhythm meant to reclaim the room. Movement was power. Sound was power. Silence was supposed to be weakness. He stopped behind the bench and addressed the panel, not her. "She's selective," he said calmly. "That tells me she understands exactly what's being asked." Alara felt the shift in the room, the way pens moved faster, the way chairs angled toward Holt, the way authority began to collect behind his words. She had been in rooms like this before. Not this exact one, not with this arrangement of uniforms and insignia, but the structure was familiar. The pressure, the slow narrowing of acceptable answers, the unspoken demand to explain yourself until you gave them something they could use against you. She didn't need to look at Holt to know where he was standing. She could hear him breathing, could sense the space he was trying to occupy. He spoke about standards next. Discipline, the foundation of the Marines, the thing that separated order from chaos. He framed it like a lesson, something meant for everyone listening, not just the woman seated below. "Discipline," he said, "requires transparency." Alara listened. She always listened. "And transparency," Holt continued, "requires full answers." "Yes, sir," she replied. The panel nodded. A few officers exchanged looks that said they were finally getting somewhere. Holt smiled faintly, encouraged. He leaned forward, elbows resting comfortably, as if this were a briefing room and not a hearing that could end her career. "You've served with joint units," he said, "outside the usual Marine chain of command." "Yes, sir." "And you're comfortable there?" "Yes, sir." The simplicity of the answers irritated him. He wanted elaboration, context, a story he could dissect. He tried another angle. "Do you consider yourself loyal to the Corps, Staff Sergeant?" "Yes, sir." "Which loyalty?" Holt pressed. "To the Marines or to these other units you've attached yourself to?" Alara felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not anger. Recognition. She had known this question would come eventually. It always did, when people looked at her record and saw the gaps, the redactions, the unexplained proximity to operations she was never supposed to be part of. "I consider myself a Marine," she said. "Nothing more." The room shifted again, unsettled by how little she offered. Holt stood and began packing once more, this time closer to her table. He talked about accountability, about how enlisted Marines were expected to answer clearly, about how silence could be interpreted as obstruction. "Silence," he said, stopping beside her, "is not neutral." Alara's eyes remained forward. "Yes, sir." Her hand stayed flat on the steel. She could feel the cold through the fabric of her sleeves. It grounded her, reminded her where she was, reminded her why she had learned to control small things when larger ones were taken away. Holt stepped back, scanning the panel as if inviting agreement. He found it. Heads nodded, pens scratched, someone underlined a line in a folder. The story was being written without her participation. Inside, Alara felt the familiar weight settle, the quiet understanding that no explanation she gave would help, that the truth, if spoken too early, would only make things worse. She had learned that lesson far from rooms like this, in places where words could cost lives instead of careers. She remembered heat pressing down through a helmet, the sound of breathing in her ears, the way silence could mean survival. She pushed the memories aside. Holt leaned into the classification issue next, his tone shifting into something that sounded almost reasonable. "We understand sensitive missions exist," he said, "but classification cannot be a shield forever." "No, sir." At some point, Staff Sergeant, repeated redactions raised concerns. "No, sir." The repetition was deliberate. She wasn't refusing to cooperate. She was obeying. The panel didn't see the difference. Holt circled the table again, his confidence growing as the room leaned with him. He spoke about reprimands that lacked detail, about assignments that didn't line up with her rank. He implied recklessness, poor judgment, a Marine who had somehow slipped through cracks she shouldn't have. Alara listened. She absorbed the words without reacting. Would it be easier to explain? To tell them about nights where radio silence was mandatory, about orders that came without signatures, about people whose names never appeared on rosters? Yes. Would it be allowed? No. She stayed quiet. Holt stopped directly in front of her now, just far enough to respect protocol. He lowered his voice, adopting something almost sympathetic. "This is your opportunity," he said. "Clarify your record, help us understand." She lifted her chin slightly. "My record is accurate, sir." The silence that followed felt different, thicker, heavier. Holt straightened, irritation leaking through the polish. "She's made her position clear," he said to the panel. "We'll proceed accordingly." The machinery resumed. Whispers grew more confident. The outcome in their minds began to solidify. Alara felt the familiar ache behind her ribs, not regret, not doubt. Loneliness. Not because she wanted support, but because she understood something they didn't. That carrying the truth sometimes meant carrying it alone, knowing that recognition might never come, knowing that obedience didn't always look noble from the outside. She glanced just briefly at the water cup someone had placed near her. She didn't reach for it. In the back row, Rear Admiral Thomas Vance watched in silence. He hadn't spoken once. His thin black folder rested on his lap, unopened now. He studied Holt's packing, the panel's reactions, the Marine seated at the center of it all. He wasn't watching her answers. He was watching her restraint. When Holt referenced a task group identifier casually, almost carelessly, Vance's attention sharpened. His fingers tightened slightly around the folder. That designation shouldn't exist here, not spoken aloud, not recorded. He didn't interrupt. He waited. Because experience had taught him that truth revealed itself best when allowed to. The recess was called shortly after. The room broke into motion, tension dissolving into casual confidence. Officers stood, talking openly now. Judgments were shared freely in the hallway, voices lowered only out of habit. She had her chance. Redactions are never a good sign. If she had something real, she'd say it. Alara remained seated. She didn't stretch, didn't shift, didn't let the break change her posture. Her breathing stayed steady. The silence stayed with her not as a shield but as a responsibility. In her mind, she returned briefly to places without names, to moments where decisions were measured not in words but in seconds, where restraint mattered more than force, where the cost of being seen was higher than the cost of being misunderstood. When the panel reconvened, something had changed. The laughter was gone, the amusement had faded, the air felt tighter, more cautious. Holt returned with renewed confidence, unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. Alara Knox sat exactly as she had before. Waiting. Not for mercy. For the moment when silence would no longer be mistaken for weakness. What happens when a room realizes it may have asked the wrong question? The shift was subtle at first, not something you could point to, just a tightening in the air when everyone settled back into their seats after recess. The confidence that had filled the room earlier didn't return with them. It lingered somewhere in the hallway, diluted by time and second thoughts. Staff Sergeant Alara Knox noticed it immediately. She had learned to feel changes like that long before she learned to name them. In briefing rooms where silence meant something was wrong. In aircraft cabins where a pause between words carried more weight than shouting ever could. When you operated in places where mistakes were quiet, you learned to read the invisible. Lieutenant General Raymond Holt took his seat with the posture of a man determined to regain momentum. He straightened the folder in front of him, adjusted his uniform, and looked down at Alara as if this were simply the continuation of a process already underway. This time he didn't pace. He stayed seated. The pressure felt heavier that way. "Let's speak plainly," Holt said, his voice controlled, measured. "Your last overseas deployment involved coordination with Navy Special Operations assets." A few heads lifted, pens paused. Alara didn't react. Holt framed the assignment carefully, using language that made it sound administrative, supportive, adjacent. He described her role as liaison, not operator, close enough to observe, not close enough to participate. "Your designation was support," he said, "not direct action." He leaned back slightly, letting the implication settle. Proximity without risk, presence without responsibility. "And yet," he continued, "your name appears repeatedly near engagement reports." The words hovered, waiting to be interpreted. Alara felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, something older, the weight of being discussed as if she weren't there. "Help us understand that," Holt said. "Classified, sir." This time, the reaction wasn't laughter. It was irritation. Someone exhaled sharply. A chair shifted. Holt's jaw tightened, though he kept his expression neutral. "Very well," he said. "Then we'll approach this differently." He lifted a page from the folder, holding it just high enough for the panel to see that it contained text, even if they couldn't read it. "These operations involved hostile contact," he said. "Rules of engagement applied." He lowered the page and looked directly at her. "If you were present," he said, "and if you were more than a bystander, then there are metrics we can discuss without compromising classification." The room leaned forward as one. "How many engagements were you involved in, Staff Sergeant?" The question was clean, clinical. "Dangerous." Alara did not answer immediately. She felt the trap close in around her, familiar and precise. She had seen it before in other forms. A forced choice where every option led somewhere bad. Speak too much and violate orders. Say too little and confirm suspicion. Holt mistook her pause for hesitation. "This isn't a trick question," he said. "It's basic accountability." The silence stretched. "How many confirmed engagements?" he pressed. Alara could feel every eye on her now. The room had stopped breathing. Even Holt leaned forward, elbows resting on the bench, his voice lower. "If you claim proximity to direct action units," he said, "then you accept scrutiny. That includes outcomes." Numbers, he thought. Numbers would pin her down. Numbers were easy to weaponize. Alara lifted her head. Slowly, deliberately. She met Holt's eyes for the first time. 73, she said. The number didn't echo. It dropped. For a moment, no one reacted at all. Pens hovered midair. A Navy admiral's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Someone leaned back without realizing they had moved. 73, Holt repeated slower now. "Yes, sir." The room recalibrated, unsure whether it had just heard confidence or disaster. "You're stating you were involved in 73 engagements," Holt said carefully. "Yes, sir." "And those resulted in confirmed kills?" "Yes, sir." The air felt thinner. This was no longer casual scrutiny. This was something else. "That's an extraordinary number," Holt said. Alara didn't respond. She wasn't here to debate adjectives. "You understand the implications," he continued, "for your role, for your chain of command." "Yes, sir." "For this hearing." "Yes, sir." Each answer was identical in tone, calm, measured, unemotional. Holt stood, circling again, but the ease was gone. His confidence had cracked just enough to let uncertainty through. "Under what authority were these actions conducted?" he asked. "Joint maritime tasking, sir." Holt nodded too quickly, seizing on the answer. "And the operation designation?" There it was. The final tightening of the noose. If she refused now, she would be accused of overstepping. If she spoke, she could be accused of violating classification. Either way, Holt believed he had control. Alara didn't hesitate. Phantom trident. The reaction was immediate. A pen clattered softly against the table. One admiral stiffened, color draining from his face. Another officer's eyes flicked instinctively toward the back of the room. Holt froze. The name shouldn't exist here. It shouldn't be spoken aloud. Not in this room, not on record, not by anyone seated at that table. In the back row, Rear Admiral Thomas Vance's posture changed completely. His hand tightened around the thin black folder in his lap. His eyes locked onto Alara with sudden intensity. Phantom trident. The room didn't move. Authority itself seemed to hesitate. Alara lowered her gaze again, returning to stillness as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Her hands remained flat on the steel, her breathing steady. Behind her, Vance closed the folder with quiet finality. He stood. The sound of his chair moving was enough. "Stop recording," he said. The blinking red lights went dark one by one. "This is no longer a public hearing." Holt opened his mouth to speak. "Sit down, General," Vance said calmly. Holt hesitated, then obeyed. "Clear the room," Vance continued. "All non-command personnel, including legal staff." Chairs scraped back. Officers filed out in stunned silence, their earlier confidence evaporating with each step. When the door closed, only senior command remained. Vance finally turned toward Alara Knox. Not with curiosity. With recognition. "What you just heard," he said to the room, "was not a boast." He paused, letting the silence do its work. It was compliance. Phantom Trident, Vance explained, was a maritime strike operation conducted in international waters. It did not exist on paper. Its objectives were achieved without attribution. Its operators were erased from record by design. Those involved, he said, were instructed to remain silent indefinitely. No reports, no commendations, no explanations. Holt's earlier certainty collapsed quietly, his posture shrinking into the chair. "You treated her silence as avoidance," Vance continued. "It was obedience." Alara remained still. She didn't look at Vance. She didn't look at Holt. She stared forward exactly as she had from the beginning. "The number you heard," Vance said, "represents actions taken under lawful orders to prevent escalation." He let the room absorb that. "You do not question records you were never cleared to see," he said evenly. "And you do not humiliate Marines for obeying orders you were never trusted with." The silence returned. This time it was different. It wasn't imposed. It was earned. And for the first time since the hearing began, Alara Knox was no longer alone in it. What does relief feel like when you've trained yourself never to expect it? For Alara Knox, it didn't arrive as a rush. It didn't loosen her shoulders or slow her breathing. It didn't feel like vindication or victory. It arrived as nothing at all. Just the continuation of stillness, as if the world had finally stopped pushing against her for a moment. Rear Admiral Thomas Vance stood at the center of the room, his presence reshaping it without effort. Authority no longer radiated from rank alone, but from certainty, the kind earned by knowing exactly what should never be spoken aloud. Lieutenant General Raymond Holt remained seated. The man who had paced, performed, and pressed now looked smaller, not because anyone had raised their voice, but because the ground beneath his assumptions had given way. "This hearing should never have taken place," Vance said calmly. The words didn't accuse, they corrected. He spoke about Phantom Trident the way one spoke about gravity, something that existed whether or not you acknowledged it. A joint maritime operation, international waters, objectives defined not by conquest, but by containment, decisions measured in consequences avoided rather than enemies eliminated. These missions, Vance continued, were designed to disappear. He let that settle. They required operators who could carry outcomes without recognition, Marines who understood that silence wasn't a lack of courage, but the cost of doing the job properly. Holt swallowed. His earlier certainty had nowhere to retreat. Alara listened without reacting. She had learned long ago that explanations, even true ones, were not meant to soothe. They were meant to clarify for those capable of hearing them. For everyone else, they were just noise. Vance turned slightly, addressing the remaining officers. "You interpreted her record as incomplete," he said. "It was intentionally stripped, reports destroyed, citations rerouted, identities protected by absence." Absence, the word resonated with Alara in a way nothing else had. She remembered names that never appeared anywhere, faces she would never see again, moments that lived only in muscle memory and quiet thought. "You mistook restraint for concealment," Vance said, "and discipline for defiance." Holt said nothing. For the first time since the hearing began, the room wasn't leaning toward power. It was leaning toward understanding. "The charges against Staff Sergeant Knox are dismissed," Vance said, "effective immediately." There was no flourish, no dramatic pause, just clarity. "She will be reassigned under direct naval authority," he continued. "This hearing will be sealed." He paused, then added quietly, "This Marine should never have been put in this position." Alara didn't move. Relief, if it came, stayed buried beneath layers of training and habit. She had learned not to trust moments like this. Outcomes could change, orders could shift. Silence was still safer than reaction. "You are dismissed, Staff Sergeant," Vance said. She stood. The movement was clean, practiced, as natural as breathing. She turned toward the door without looking back. And something happened behind her. A chair moved. Then another. No command was given. No protocol demanded it. One officer stood, then another, then another. By the time Alara reached the door, every remaining officer in the room was on their feet. Not in salute. In respect. She paused only long enough to open the door, then stepped through. She did not look back. The corridor outside felt different, brighter somehow, though the lighting hadn't changed. Her boots echoed softly against the floor as she walked away, shoulders square, pace steady. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no triumph. What had happened in that room wasn't something she carried forward. It was something that had ended. Behind the closed door, Lieutenant General Holt remained seated alone. The room that had amplified his authority now reflected it back at him in silence. No nods, no whispers, just the echo of how casually power could be misused and how quietly it could be corrected. Alara didn't think about him. She rarely thought about people like him for long. Days later, the setting changed. The Pentagon didn't feel hostile the way the courtroom had. It felt focused, purposeful. Long corridors, muted conversations, secure doors that opened only for those who belonged there. Alara sat at a briefing table with officers who didn't laugh at silence. They watched her instead. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. A Navy commander asked a question meant to test boundaries. She answered without defensiveness. A civilian analyst challenged an assumption. She adjusted, not retreating, not posturing. She spoke sparingly, clean sentences, precise language, no stories, no emotional coloring. Words to her were tools, not outlets. The room responded. Shoulders eased. Pens stopped tapping. Questions became sharper, more collaborative. The tone shifted from evaluation to trust, not dramatic, not sudden, but real. No one mentioned the hearing. No one mentioned Phantom Trident. The past stayed sealed, carried forward only in how she worked. In the weeks that followed, her presence became expected. Meetings paused until she arrived. Chairs turned toward her when she spoke, not because of rank but because of consistency. She didn't seek authority. She earned confidence. Late one evening, after a long briefing, Alara stood alone near a window overlooking the city. The lights below looked distant and unreal, like something observed rather than lived. She thought about how close she had come to being erased, not by enemies, but by misunderstanding. How easily silence could be mistaken for weakness by those who had never needed it. She felt the familiar ache again, not regret. Responsibility. Because carrying truth without display wasn't heroic. It was lonely. It meant accepting that some things would never be explained, that some people would never know what you had prevented. She had made peace with that long ago. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. Rear Admiral Vance stood in the doorway. "You did well," he said simply. She nodded once. "That room wasn't built for people like you," he added. "But that doesn't mean you were wrong to stand your ground." "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment, then spoke more softly. "There are many who serve loudly," he said, "and a few who serve quietly. The quiet ones carry more than anyone ever sees." Alara said nothing. She didn't need reassurance. She didn't need validation. She needed clarity. And for the first time in a long while, she had it. As she left the building that night, the city air felt cooler, the noise softer, the weight she carried unchanged, but better understood by at least one other person. She walked forward without looking back. Because some paths aren't about being seen. They're about staying steady long enough for truth to catch up. And when it does, it doesn't shout. It simply stands. What does a future look like when your past can never be acknowledged? For Alara Knox, the question followed her quietly, not as doubt but as a constant companion. It surfaced in the pauses between briefings, in the moments just before sleep, in the way people now looked at her, with trust, not curiosity, without knowing why. The reassignment orders came without ceremony. No apology attached, no explanation offered. Just clean language and precise routing, direct naval command, joint operational integration, indefinite duration. She read the orders once, then again, then folded the paper neatly and placed it back into the envelope, as if respecting it too much to leave it open. Nothing in the language surprised her. What surprised her was how little she felt. No relief, no pride. Only readiness. Her new workspace sat deeper in the building, behind layers of access most people never saw. The rooms were smaller, the lighting softer, the conversations quieter. Here, people didn't speak to fill space. They spoke when words mattered. Her presence changed the rhythm at first. Not because she asserted herself, but because she didn't. In meetings, she listened longer than others expected. She asked fewer questions. When she did speak, it was never to dominate the room, never to display expertise. She identified pressure points, gaps in assumptions, risks that didn't announce themselves loudly. People began to notice. Not immediately. Trust like that never arrived all at once. It accumulated. A planner started asking for her input before finalizing timelines. An intelligence officer waited an extra beat before dismissing an anomaly, remembering the way Alara paused before speaking. A commander changed phrasing mid-brief after catching her expression, subtle, unreadable, but attentive. She didn't correct them openly. She guided. At night, alone in her quarters, the quiet felt heavier. Not threatening. Familiar. She sat on the edge of the bed sometimes, boots off, uniform folded precisely, hands resting on her knees the way they had on the steel table weeks earlier. Stillness was second nature now, but stillness also left room for memory. She didn't replay moments the way some people did. There were no dramatic flashes, no cinematic sequences. Just fragments. A radio going silent. A breath held longer than comfort allowed. The weight of responsibility settling in before the outcome was known. She had learned early that regret wasn't useful in places like that. Reflection was, awareness, the discipline to carry lessons forward without turning them into wounds. Still, some nights she wondered, not if she would do it again. She knew that answer. She wondered whether the institution that now relied on her would ever fully understand the cost of what it asked from people like her, or whether it would always be easier to rely on silence than to confront what silence meant. The answer didn't matter. The work did. Weeks turned into months. Her name began to circulate quietly, not as legend, not as rumor, but as a reference. Ask Knox. She'll catch it. She sees things others don't. She never corrected anyone who misunderstood her role. She never clarified her past. She never used phantom trident as currency. That chapter remained sealed. One afternoon, during a long planning session that stretched into evening, a junior officer lingered after the room cleared. He hesitated, shifting his weight, clearly unsure whether to speak. "Staff Sergeant," he said finally, "may I ask you something?" She nodded. "How do you know when to speak up?" he asked, "and when not to?" The question wasn't about protocol. It was about fear. Alara considered him for a moment. She didn't answer immediately. She rarely did. "You speak," she said, "when your silence would cost more than your words." He frowned slightly, processing. "And when does silence cost more?" he asked. She met his eyes. "When it protects ego instead of people." He nodded slowly. That was all. He left with more than he'd come for. Later that night, she walked the long corridor back to her quarters, the hum of the building steady around her. She passed offices where lights still burned, people still working, still chasing outcomes that would never carry their names. She respected that. She had always respected it. Because she understood something many never did. That recognition wasn't the point. Responsibility was. The call came early one morning. No context, no build-up. Just a secure line and a short directive. There was a situation developing offshore, unstable, sensitive, the kind of scenario that didn't tolerate noise. They wanted her assessment. Not her presence. Her judgment. She sat at the table as information streamed in. Satellite images, intercepted communications, incomplete timelines. People spoke around her, filling space with analysis. She waited. Then she spoke. Quietly. She pointed to a detail others had skimmed past, a timing discrepancy, a behavioral pattern that didn't match stated intent. The room went silent. They adjusted. Hours later, escalation was avoided. No announcement followed. No statement released. The situation resolved itself into something manageable, then forgettable. Exactly as intended. That night as she left the building, Alara paused outside for a moment. The sky above the city was clouded, the stars hidden. She didn't mind. She had never needed things to be visible to believe they existed. She thought briefly of the hearing, of the laughter that had preceded judgment, of how easily silence had been misread. She didn't feel anger. She felt understanding. Institutions weren't malicious. They were impatient. They struggled with ambiguity. They preferred loud proof over quiet consistency. People like her lived in the space between. And that was okay. Because someone had to. A message arrived a few days later. Short, direct. Rear Admiral Vance requested her presence. She found him in a modest office, stripped of excess, the way spaces became when the person inside didn't need reminders of authority. He gestured for her to sit. "I won't keep you long," he said. "I wanted you to know something." She waited. There was pushback, he continued. After the hearing, quiet questions, doubts. She nodded once. "I expected that," she said. He studied her. "They wanted to understand you," he said. "I told them that wasn't the point." A faint pause. "People like you," Vance added, "aren't meant to be understood easily. You're meant to be relied on." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. He leaned back slightly. "There may come a time," he said, "when silence won't protect you, when the institution will need to acknowledge what it asks of its quiet professionals." She met his gaze. "If that time comes," she said, "I'll follow orders." Vance smiled, not warmly but with respect. "I know," he said. As she left his office, Alara felt the familiar weight settle again. Not heavier, not lighter. Just present. She walked down the corridor, boots steady, posture unchanged. Her path forward was clear, even if it would never be visible to most. And she was at peace with that. Because strength, she had learned, wasn't about being seen at the right moment. It was about being steady at the wrong one. And carrying the truth forward, even when no one asked you to explain it. Especially then. What remains when the noise finally fades, and all that's left is who you chose to be? For Alara Knox, the answer didn't arrive in a single moment. It emerged slowly, in the quiet accumulation of days where nothing dramatic happened, and that somehow felt like success. The institution moved the way institutions always did. Forward, efficient, forgetful. New crises replaced old ones. New names circulated through secure rooms. New problems demanded attention, urgency, certainty. And Alara stayed where she was. Not elevated into legend, not buried into obscurity. Useful, trusted, invisible in the way that mattered most. She never spoke about the hearing again, not because it hurt and not because it frightened her, but because it no longer defined her. It had been a test, not of truth, but of endurance, and endurance, once proven, didn't need repetition. There were moments, though small ones, when the memory surfaced uninvited. A junior officer hesitating before speaking, then choosing restraint instead of bravado. A commander pausing a briefing, glancing at Alara before pushing a decision forward. A quiet recalibration in a room that would never know why it felt steadier than it used to. Those moments mattered. They told her the work had left a mark, even if her name hadn't. Late one evening, months after the hearing, Alara found herself alone in a nearly empty operations center. Most of the lights were dimmed. Screens glowed softly, showing data feeds that required monitoring but no intervention. She sat with her hands folded, posture relaxed but alert, eyes moving calmly from one display to another. This was the space she understood best. Not the courtroom, not the spotlight. The waiting. She thought about the younger version of herself, the one who had believed excellence would speak for itself, who had believed that if you did everything right, recognition would follow naturally. Experience had taught her otherwise. Excellence didn't speak. It endured. The secure phone rang. She answered without hesitation. A developing situation, a region teetering, signals that didn't align with public messaging. Decision makers needed clarity, not certainty, not speed, but perspective. She listened, asked 2 questions, then spoke. Her recommendation wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve force or escalation. It involved patience, a delay, letting pressure dissipate instead of amplifying it. The room resisted at first, then listened. Hours later, the situation resolved itself quietly. No headlines, no briefings, just another potential crisis that never became one. Alara logged the decision and shut down her console. As she stood to leave, she caught her reflection in the darkened glass of a monitor. Not heroic, not hardened, just steady. She wondered briefly how many others like her existed. Men and women who carried weight without ceremony, who accepted misunderstanding as part of the cost, who learned to live without validation because the work itself demanded it. She knew they were there. She had felt them in the pauses of meetings, in the careful phrasing of orders, in the restraint that sometimes replaced aggression when no one was watching closely enough to applaud. That was the real legacy. Not numbers, not stories, standards. Weeks later, she was asked to speak to a small group of incoming personnel, not a formal address, no podium, no prepared remarks, just a room with folding chairs and a handful of faces that still believed the loudest voice carried the most weight. She stood at the front, hands relaxed at her sides. They expected a story. She gave them silence. It unsettled them. Then she spoke. "You will be taught many things here," she said. "Skills, procedures, protocol." She paused. "But the hardest lesson won't be written down." They leaned in. "You will learn that doing the right thing doesn't always look right to other people," she continued. "You will be misunderstood, sometimes by strangers, sometimes by people you respect." No one interrupted. "You'll be tempted to explain yourself," she said, "to defend, to justify." Another pause. "Sometimes that's necessary," she admitted, "and sometimes it is." A hand went up. "How do you know the difference?" someone asked. Alara considered the question. "You don't," she said honestly, "not right away." A few nervous smiles. "You learn it over time," she continued, "by asking yourself who benefits from your words and who benefits from your restraint." The room stayed quiet. "When silence protects people," she said, "it's not weakness, it's service." She thanked them and stepped back. No applause followed. She hadn't expected any. Later that night, she walked alone beneath an open sky. The air was cool, the city distant, the world continuing, indifferent and alive. She thought about Lieutenant General Holt, not with bitterness but with clarity, about how easily authority could mistake confidence for correctness, how dangerous it was to confuse volume with truth. She thought about Rear Admiral Vance and the quiet courage it took to interrupt power without raising your voice. And she thought about herself, about the moment she had said 73. Not because it shocked them, but because it was true. She had carried those actions without pride, without display, without expectation that anyone would ever ask. The number had never defined her. The discipline had. She reached her quarters and paused before going inside. There would be more work, more silence, more moments where restraint would matter more than recognition. She was ready for them, because somewhere along the way, she had learned something most never did. That dignity doesn't need witnesses. That strength doesn't require an audience. And that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding everything together. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is nothing at all. No defense, no explanation, no demand to be seen. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.